The nurse had spent her entire life caring for strangers, but that night, standing alone beneath the harsh fluorescent lights of a nearly empty hospital corridor, she finally broke down. Her hands trembled as she stared at the phone in her palm, listening to the news that had turned her world upside down. Her mother was dying hundreds of miles away, and she had no money for a ticket home. She had given everything she had to keep other people alive, yet when the person she loved most needed her, she could not even afford the journey to say goodbye. She quietly covered her mouth to stop herself from sobbing, unaware that someone was standing just a few steps away, watching her with an expression that would soon change both of their lives forever. He had walked into that hospital expecting an ordinary night, but before morning came, he would make a promise that would cost him almost nothing and mean everything to her. And sometimes, the smallest act of kindness arrives at the exact moment when someone has stopped believing that kindness exists. If you believe that kindness can change a person's life, that second chances are real, and that one compassionate decision can become someone's greatest hope, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, leave a comment, and subscribe to Kindness Speaks. Your support helps us bring more emotional stories like this to people who need them. Her name was Emily, a 32-year-old nurse who had learned how to remain calm when everyone else was falling apart. For years, she had stood beside hospital beds while families cried, doctors delivered difficult news, and patients fought battles nobody else could see. She knew how to measure a pulse, read a monitor, administer medication, comfort frightened children, and hold the hands of elderly patients who had nobody else to hold theirs. What she did not know how to do was accept helplessness when the person lying helplessly in another hospital was her own mother. Emily had grown up in a small town where money had always been tight but love had never been scarce. Her mother, Margaret, had raised her alone after Emily's father disappeared from their lives when she was still young. Margaret worked long hours cleaning offices and taking occasional sewing jobs at night. She had repaired Emily's school uniform instead of buying a new one, packed simple lunches, and sometimes pretended she had already eaten so that her daughter could have the last portion. Emily had never forgotten those sacrifices. They were written into her memory like photographs that time could never fade. When Emily became a nurse, her mother had been the proudest person in the world. She had framed Emily's nursing certificate and placed it above the little dining table in their home. Every time Emily visited, Margaret would look at that certificate with the same quiet smile. She never cared that her daughter did not have a luxurious house, an expensive car, or a large bank account. She cared that the little girl she had once carried through poverty had grown into a woman who spent her days caring for others. But life had a way of testing even the strongest people. Margaret had become ill several months earlier. At first, she dismissed the symptoms as ordinary exhaustion. Then came the hospital visits, the tests, the medications, and eventually the devastating diagnosis. Her condition was serious, and the treatment was expensive. Emily tried to help with every dollar she could spare. She worked extra shifts, skipped meals, delayed her own bills, and quietly sold a few things she had once treasured. She never complained to her mother because Margaret already carried enough fear. Then, one cold evening, Emily's phone rang while she was finishing her shift. The moment she heard the voice on the other end, something inside her collapsed. Her mother's condition had suddenly worsened. The doctors believed she might have only a short time left. Emily needed to come home as soon as possible. She rushed into an empty staff room and closed the door behind her. She pressed the phone against her chest and tried to breathe. Her mind immediately began calculating the cost of a ticket, transportation from the station, food, and everything else she might need. She opened her banking application with shaking fingers. The balance on the screen was painfully small. She stared at it for several seconds as though looking at it long enough might somehow make the number change. It did not. Emily searched online for travel prices, hoping to find something cheaper. Every option seemed impossible. The cheapest ticket was still more than she could afford. She checked her credit card, but it was already near its limit because of her mother's medical expenses. She opened her wallet and counted the cash. Not enough. She sat down slowly, staring at the floor. For the first time in years, Emily felt completely powerless. She had spent countless nights telling frightened patients that they were not alone. She had encouraged families to stay strong. She had held strangers' hands and promised them that tomorrow could be better. But now she was the one who needed someone to tell her that. A tear slipped down her cheek. Then another. She quickly wiped them away because she had always believed that crying at work was a weakness. But that night there was nobody left to impress. She lowered her head and quietly sobbed into her hands. She did not notice the man who had stopped outside the staff room. His name was Daniel Carter. He was 41 and had come to the hospital because his younger brother had been admitted after an accident. Daniel was successful, financially comfortable, and accustomed to solving problems by throwing resources at them. Yet despite his wealth, he had never felt particularly close to the people around him. His career had taught him to negotiate contracts, evaluate risks, and make decisions quickly. It had not taught him what to do when someone was hurting in a way that money could not immediately fix. He had seen Emily many times during the previous 2 days. She had been the nurse caring for his brother, and he had noticed something unusual about her. She never rushed past a patient without checking whether they needed anything. She remembered small details. She spoke gently even when she was exhausted. When Daniel's brother had become frightened during the night, Emily had stayed longer than necessary simply to make sure he was calm. Daniel had noticed her kindness. Now he noticed her pain. He could have walked away. Most people would have. Instead, he waited until Emily had wiped her face and stepped into the hallway. She immediately straightened herself, trying to hide what had happened. Daniel did not ask invasive questions. He simply told her that he had overheard enough to understand that she was trying to get home to her mother. Emily was embarrassed. She tried to explain that she would figure something out, even though she had no idea how. Daniel looked at her for a long moment and realized something important. She was not asking him for money. She was not looking for sympathy. She was simply a daughter who wanted the chance to be beside her mother before it was too late. Daniel told her they would go together. Emily thought she had misunderstood him. But he repeated himself. He would drive her. The journey would take several hours, but he did not care. Emily hesitated because accepting help from a stranger felt uncomfortable. She had spent her entire life learning how to survive without asking anyone for anything. Pride had become a shield she wore so often that she sometimes forgot it was there. Daniel understood. He did not make her feel like a charity case. He simply told her that if someone he loved were dying and he had no way to reach them, he would hope someone would help him too. Those words broke the final wall she had built around herself. Emily nodded. Within minutes, she had arranged for another nurse to cover the remainder of her shift. Daniel went to retrieve his car. As they drove into the night, the city slowly disappeared behind them. Tall buildings became quiet neighborhoods, neighborhoods became highways, and highways stretched into darkness. For the first hour, neither of them said much. Emily stared through the passenger window, clutching her phone. Every few minutes, she checked for a message from the hospital where her mother was staying. Nothing. Her fear grew with every passing mile. Daniel kept his eyes on the road. He had expected the journey to be about helping Emily. Instead, it became a journey into his own past. His mother had died when he was 23. At the time, he had been studying and working constantly, convinced that there would always be another weekend, another holiday, another chance to visit. His mother had often asked him to come home for dinner, but Daniel had always promised he would make time later. Later never came. She died unexpectedly before he could say goodbye. For 18 years, Daniel had carried that regret silently. That was why, when he saw Emily sitting beside him with tears gathering in her eyes, he understood exactly what she was fighting against. He did not want another person to live with the regret he had carried for nearly 2 decades. Several hours into the journey, Emily finally received a message. Her mother's condition had become critical. Emily's hands began shaking. She asked Daniel to drive faster. He did everything safely possible, but the road seemed endless. Emily leaned her forehead against the window and whispered a prayer. She remembered her childhood. She remembered her mother's hands. She remembered being 6 years old and frightened during a thunderstorm while Margaret sat beside her bed until morning. She remembered her first day of school, when she had been afraid to enter the classroom and her mother had waited outside until Emily felt brave. She remembered the night she received her nursing school acceptance letter. Margaret had cried harder than Emily had. She remembered the day she graduated. Her mother had hugged her so tightly that Emily could barely breathe. Those memories were no longer ordinary memories. They were becoming a countdown. Daniel drove through the darkness while Emily fought against the possibility that she might arrive too late. Near dawn, they finally reached the town. Emily could barely sit still. When the car stopped outside the hospital, she rushed through the entrance. Daniel followed at a respectful distance. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and quiet sadness. A nurse recognized Emily and immediately led her toward her mother's room. Emily opened the door. Margaret was lying in the bed, pale and exhausted. For one terrible second, Emily thought she was too late. Then Margaret opened her eyes. And smiled. Emily rushed to her side and took her hand. All the strength she had carried for years disappeared. She cried against her mother's shoulder like a little girl. Margaret lifted one trembling hand and touched her daughter's hair. She did not need to ask how Emily had managed to get there. She simply held her. Outside the room, Daniel stood silently. He had expected to feel like a hero. Instead, he felt humbled. He had only driven a car. But sometimes, what seems small to one person is everything to another. The next several hours were quiet. Emily stayed beside her mother. Daniel eventually left the room to get coffee, but before leaving, he told Emily he would wait nearby in case she needed anything. He expected to be gone for a few minutes. He stayed for hours. Margaret's condition stabilized temporarily, giving Emily precious time. As the morning light entered the hospital windows, Emily walked into the hallway and found Daniel sitting alone. She thanked him. He simply nodded. But their story was not finished. Over the following days, Margaret received treatment and slowly improved enough to speak more comfortably. The crisis had passed, but the doctors warned that her illness was still serious and that she would need continued care. Emily began making plans to bring her mother closer to her. That was when another problem appeared. Emily could not afford the cost. She had already exhausted her savings. She had accumulated debt from medical expenses. She had no family nearby. And she could not continue working the same exhausting schedule while caring for Margaret. For the first time, Emily wondered whether she would have to choose between her career and her mother. Daniel heard about the situation. But he did not simply hand Emily a large amount of money. Instead, he offered something more meaningful. He used his business connections to help arrange affordable transportation, temporary housing, and access to a community medical assistance program. He also quietly contacted the hospital administration to make sure Emily could take family leave without losing her position. Emily eventually discovered that Daniel had helped behind the scenes. She was overwhelmed. But what moved her most was that he had never once made her feel indebted. He had not treated her like someone beneath him. He had treated her like someone whose life mattered. Months passed. Margaret's health remained fragile, but she was alive. Emily returned to work part-time. Daniel continued visiting the hospital, initially because of his brother and later because he had formed a genuine friendship with Emily and Margaret. Something changed inside him too. Before meeting Emily, Daniel had believed that success meant having enough money that nothing could ever threaten you. After that journey, he realized that real wealth was something else. It was having someone who would drive through the night because you were afraid. It was having someone sit beside you when you were waiting for terrible news. It was having someone believe your